Hello and welcome to episode 73 of Radicals in Conversation, the monthly podcast from Pluto Press, one of the world's leading independent radical publishers. I'm your host, Chris Brown. At the time of recording, Israel's relentless bombardment of Rafah in the south of the Gaza Strip continues, in spite of a ruling from the International Court of Justice. Around 1 million people have been forced to flee the city. Yesterday, an airstrike killed 45 people. Another overnight has killed a further 16. Condemning the assault on the Rafah, this week Spain, Ireland and Norway join 140 other countries in officially recognising a Palestinian state. It's a symbolic action that has undoubtedly deteriorated diplomatic relations between the three countries and Israel. Nevertheless, the destruction continues, and Palestinians in Gaza have nowhere safe to go. Many of us around the world have looked on in horror for the last 7 months, watching a genocide being carried out, with many of our own governments actively complicit. In this episode of the podcast, we consider the vital role that people in the international labour movement can play, leveraging their union's power to intervene directly. It's a privilege to welcome to the show today 3 guests, all of whom are deeply engaged with the question of how the international labour movement can act in solidarity with Palestine. They are Rafah Ziadah, a senior lecturer in politics and public policy at King's College London and an organiser with Workers in Palestine. Raya Al-Sana, an organiser and researcher with Workers in Palestine, and Katie Fox-Hodes, a senior lecturer in employment relations at the University of Sheffield and a researcher and labour educator with Workers in Palestine. Rafah, Raya and Katie talk about the history of labour solidarity in the context of the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, Palestinian workers' conditions in Gaza and the West Bank, and how trade unions can move beyond simply issuing statements in solidarity with Palestinians. We discuss the ongoing university encampments, dock workers and block the boat actions, and the ways in which the pro-Palestine movement can build coalitions with workers organising in the arms industry to prevent the flow of weapons to Israel. So without further ado, here are Rafah, Raya and Katie on Radicals in Conversation. Firstly, I'd like to thank you all very much for taking the time to come on the show today. I really appreciate it. Pluto really appreciates it. There's quite a few of us on the call, more than usual, so maybe we should just start with some very quick introductions, just to put a voice to a name, I guess, for our listeners. Yeah, so could you each maybe just tell us very briefly, who you are, where you're based, and I guess anything else that you feel is relevant relating to your professional or political backgrounds, just for some context. So, Rafah, perhaps I'll start with you.
Hey, hi, Chris, and thanks for hosting us. My name is Rafah. I am Palestinian, and I'm an organizer with Workers in Palestine. I am based in London at the moment.
Fantastic. Raya, how about yourself?
Hello, thanks for having us. My name is Raya. I'm a Palestinian organizer and researcher with Workers in Palestine. I'm based between London and Palestine.
Thanks, Raya. And Katie, listeners may be familiar. I think you were on the show 6 years ago or something like that, but tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Sure. Hi, I'm Katie Fox-Hodes. I'm a senior lecturer in employment relations at the University of Sheffield, and I have been supporting Workers in Palestine as a researcher and labour educator.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, and welcome to you all to the show. So I guess in preparation for this episode, I always try and do a bit of reading, and Rafah, I read your chapter in Generation Palestine, Voices from the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Movement, which Pluto published way back in 2013, I think. And your contribution in that book looked at BDS in the international trade union movement. And I suppose, at the time the piece was reasonably optimistic, and it referenced a number of unions in Egypt, Britain, Brazil, Sweden, South Africa, Ireland and elsewhere, which had adopted, at the very least, a sort of commitment on paper to BDS, and some of whom had engaged in industrial action as well in response to Israeli atrocities. I think the attack on the Freedom Flotilla in 2010. Now, obviously, many years have passed since that book was published. I wouldn't expect you to be able to recall in any great detail the content of that chapter, but if you could maybe speak in general terms about how things have changed in the last decade or so, maybe up until the events of October last year, with regards to the labour movement and its solidarity with the Palestinian cause in general.
Yeah, thanks for reminding me of that chapter. I did write it a long time ago, but I remember it quite well because I was directly involved in many of those campaigns as the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement really started to organize and take seriously organizing within the trade union movement. I am very proud of one of my, greatest achievements earlier on around this work was working with the Canadian Union of Public Employees to pass the first BDS motion in a Canadian union. And at that point, it was the first, and we were very heavily attacked. But it did lead us to thinking very seriously, systematically about how do you build support for Palestine within the trade union movement. And there isn't really a way to speak about what has happened since October 7th internationally in the trade union movement without really thinking of this longer term work that organizers have been doing for quite some time. The hard work of education, the hard work of building rank and file solidarity, it's really what has led us to this moment. Those campaigns began the conversation about Palestine in the trade union movement, and it began the discussions around how do we think of internationalism and trade union solidarity. We are today at a moment where the trade union movement has been under consistent attack for decades, where service unionism is really how things operate within the trade union movement. And trying to shift this into real internationalism and solidarity around Palestine actually takes quite a lot of work, very steady, long term work. And really, that is what has led us to this moment where we are seeing a genocide unfold in front of our eyes in Gaza, a televised genocide. And the Palestinian trade union movement, very early on October 16th, issued a call asking the international trade union movement to show solidarity, but most importantly, end the arms trade and transport. So, actually, halt the production and limit and end the transport of weapons going to Israel. That call builds on this longer history of solidarity. We have seen reactions to this call, we have endorsements of this call, but I would say we still have a lot of work ahead of us in terms of building rank and file solidarity to actually move beyond motions. When I wrote that chapter, we were in a phase of writing motions and passing motions within trade unions. I think today we've laid that groundwork, and what we need is to move beyond motions to actually actions taking place, to actually seeing unions make sure there's direct action to stop the arms trade. And I think that's the big difference in this moment is we have passed the point of just motions on paper and we are seeking real action and real solidarity.
Yeah, absolutely. Raya, I think you tweeted maybe last week, unions can do more than just issue statements. It's time they utilised their power, which I guess is probably a summary of what we might be talking about in general today. Yeah, I mean, I did have a question. I think there has been a turn maybe to organising. That's like a phrase we hear in relation to trade unions in recent years. But I guess many trade union members might still believe that their union's attention is best orientated towards, bread and butter issues, things more directly related to their workplaces, pay and conditions, pensions, and so on. I mean, I doubt that's the position of anyone on this call today. So, why is international solidarity, and I guess specifically in relation to Palestinian liberation, a fundamental part of what a trade union should be about? Why is it beneficial to the health of the union and its membership as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think we see at the moment also how kind of like the integration of unions picking up Palestine also infuses the union activism as well, right? And I think for historically, a central ethos of the trade union movement is that an injury to one is an injury to all, out of a conception of the link of the international solidarity and the relationships between what happens at home is very much linked to what happens in other places, and what happens in other places is also fundamentally linked to conditions and working conditions at home, right? And that when we are fighting within our unions, we're fighting for kind of that moment in and of itself, but for the solidarity on a much broader scale. And I think there's often been the kind of sidelining of issues of international solidarity as extra trade union work, right? As issues that move away the work, what the unions should be doing in terms of fighting for their membership, right? The movement that we want to aspire towards, or what we want to be trying to build, is thinking through how those things actually reinforce each other and how they feed into each other. And I think some of the examples we're seeing at the moment in terms of people picking up Palestine as a struggle in the union movement also helps to move and infuse the movement with new energy and kind of empower the movement as a whole, right? Empower it for the benefit of everybody else. And I think that's some of the exciting examples that we're seeing now in terms of the fight here in the UK with Unite, the union that organizes in the arms industry, and what does it mean for workers there to also be picking up Palestine and organizing and galvanizing around the call that has come out from Palestine. What does it mean in the university sector of picking up that call and organizing around ending ties with the military industry? That it's also a struggle for what does it mean for us to transform our own workplaces, right? And kind of how do we take ownership over the spaces that we work in? And those open up a very big questions around agency. How do we use our agency as workers to transform to transform the institutions that we work for, but in doing that also gain an understanding of what does it mean to also work towards transforming our societies, our communities, and our world, where we don't just think about ourselves, but see ourselves in relation to others. The trade union movement is a great space to be doing that, and it's important. It's a critically important space to be doing that. In forging those connections as well, I think we move away from some of the some of the racialized and racist tendencies that sometimes can appear when we just focus around kind of issues of pay and our own rights as workers, right? Because that starts siloing us from other sections of the working class internationally. And I think by thinking about ourselves as an internationalist class, we move away from that.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, we're going to talk, I think, probably today mainly about solidarity actions as sort of internationally. But I feel it'd be wrong if we didn't touch on talking about Palestinian workers themselves, maybe putting some of this into context. It almost seems foolish to ask what, workers' conditions are like in Gaza and in the occupied territories right now, but should probably ask the question anyway. And, maybe also it'd be good to think about or consider the conditions and the treatment of Palestinian workers in Gaza and the occupied territories more historically. To what extent have Palestinians been integrated into the Israeli economy? How has the Palestinian economy fared over the last few decades? And I guess just, giving us some of that context to understand where the Palestinian trade union movement is coming from. As you say, there was this call out to the international movement back in October. So just some of this context, if anyone could chime in there, that'd be really useful.
That's a very, very important question. And actually, one of the surprising things for us is that quite often people will say they're in solidarity with Palestine, but actually not speak about Palestinian workers or the conditions of Palestinian workers. Sometimes solidarity is given as if Palestinians are all one equal entity, rather than actually thinking about the differences among Palestinians as well. And Palestinian workers have been at the forefront of the Palestinian struggle historically. In this latest genocide, the headquarters of the Palestinian General Federation of Trade Unions in Gaza have been bombed. So have all their other offices. It's important to note that our colleagues in the trade union movement in Gaza, particularly PGFTU Gaza, have not left Gaza City. Palestinian workers are still in Gaza trying to ensure that communities are surviving. Teachers are teaching in makeshift tents. People are trying to form committees to distribute food. They are there doing what workers do, keeping things moving and keeping communities alive and safe. When we speak about doctors or nurses, there's been a lot said about the healthcare sector. Well, they are workers that have put their life on the line, on the front lines, literally, to ensure that communities survive. The conditions, of course, have been horrific for Palestinian workers well before this genocide began, because Israel has been strangulating the Palestinian economy for decades now. There has not been a situation where Palestinian workers haven't been targeted. The systematic destruction of the economy, the agricultural sector, the siege that has been imposed. Before this genocide, Gaza already had the world's highest unemployment rate. This mostly hit Palestinian women and youth, and refugees in particular. So we have seen decades of Israel systematically destroying the Palestinian economy and targeting Palestinian workers. And by the way, this is not just in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Some of the poorest Palestinian communities are also in 48 Palestine, where workers there are also consistently targeted. And we have to always center the lived reality of Palestinian workers, this systematic targeting of Palestinian workers, which is part and parcel of Israeli settler colonialism. Israeli settler colonialism is based on kicking Palestinians off our land, making people workers, and then destroying that economy upon which they depend. This has been systematic, this has been ongoing, and it's really troubling to me sometimes when we don't center the life of Palestinian workers and what Palestinian workers have done historically in the Palestinian struggle. Today, whether in Gaza or the West Bank, because of the destruction of the economy, Palestinian workers are struggling with daily life. The genocide in Gaza is what we see on TV screens, but in the West Bank as well, the economic situation has meant that many workers are not getting paid their full salary cuts by up to 50% to 80%. If we're speaking about Palestinian teachers, for example, the salary itself is around $300 per month. So cutting that really means that families are being systematically hurt. Sometimes, breadwinners within a family are the only earners. So you're not speaking about affecting a single family, but actually an entire community when you're cutting these jobs. Within the solidarity movement, I think we need to put a lot more effort into speaking about Palestinian workers and understanding the historic role, understanding that there have been strikes in Palestine historically, but also in the last 10 years, with essentially the Palestinian Authority taking on the World Bank program of neoliberalizing the Palestinian economy, we have seen living standards completely drop, indebtedness completely at a higher rate. And this is all to destroy Palestinian communities and make them weaker, unable to resist, essentially. One arm of Israeli settler colonialism is the militarism, but another arm equally is an economic strategy of circulation that targets Palestinian communities. And we always have to center those two sides.
Yeah, thanks, Rafif. I think that's really clear. Well, talking, I guess, a little bit more about what's been emerging from the Palestinian trade union movement, we've already touched on it, but, the Palestinian General Federation of Trade Unions, Gaza, put out a call to the international labour movement to strike on May Day and Nakba Day. They made suggestions as to what actions trade unionists might take, refusing to handle goods from or bound for Israel, stopping work on these days, doing workplace education around the struggle, providing resources for action, and campaigning for policy changes like divesting pension funds and so on. So what's your sense of the extent to which this kind of call for action has been taken up? And have any new links been forged that you're aware of between the Palestinian and the international labour movements?
Yeah, so I think this call comes on the back of the call that Rafif mentioned earlier on, that it came out on the 16th of October, calling for direct international solidarity in the form of ending the supply of arms and kind of cutting links with the Israeli military industrial complex and other forms of solidarity. And since then, the call has been really picked up internationally. So, for example, Belgian workers in the airports refused to transport arms destined to Israel. Dock workers in Barcelona similarly have said that they will refuse to transport arms to Israel. Port workers in India have also come out saying that they will not be transporting weaponry to Israel. And I think that it has been picked up in this way. And an important element of what has happened since then is the centering of the voice of Palestinian workers, is picking up Palestine as an issue for workers, and it is picking up Palestine as an issue for the trade union movement as well. And I think that is as equally as important as the precise kind of victories, if we want to call them victories, of not transporting the arm and so on. I think those are very important political steps that have taken place, and it's important we recognize the kind of the shift that has happened due to that call from Palestine and the agency that Palestinian workers have exerted in this moment in time. One of the interesting things that happened on May 1st is in the University of Santa Cruz, where workers really picked up that call for strike action, and graduate workers voted to adhere to that call and take strike action on the day. And this really is kind of an impressive moment in the labor movement solidarity with Palestine, that workers picked up the call and engaged in a political strike in solidarity with Palestine, recognizing what that would mean and the power to do that. And I think, in a way, what is happening now with the broader layers of workers at the University of California also coming out and voting for strike action around divesting from Israeli military companies, around facilitating alternative funding for those who are receiving funding from the military industry, amnesty for all, and the protection of freedom of speech and to organize on campus, is also in relation to that, right? That happened before, and in relation to longer period of struggle that I think Katie can speak a bit more to, because she was also involved in that. But I think people have picked up also the call in different ways. There's been big organizing around the arms factories in various places, with people organizing kind of blockades in those factories, oriented towards engaging with workers on the day and having conversations about the link between their workplace and the ongoing genocide in Palestine, and longer histories of dispossession. Workers in their workplaces organized on that day kind of conversations centering Palestine, demonstrations around May Day were really kind of picked up the call from Palestinian workers. And so there's kind of a multifaceted and varied way in which people have been picking up the call from Palestinian workers. And that really showed in terms of the actions on the day. And really on the day, we saw also how things have been slowly building. There's been a slow kind of accumulative process of building since October and before that, but much more intensely since October.
I might just add something on the sort of longer history there, particularly in the US, where I'm from. As Raya said, there's just this incredible strike happening currently at the University of California, which is a statewide university system. It's the largest academic workers union in the country. So it's graduate students, postdoctoral researchers, permanent researchers, 48,000 members statewide have voted to go on strike, and that's come out of a 10-year period of activism around this in that union. 10 years ago, I was a PhD student at Berkeley when we our statewide union, as the leadership, we decided to hold a direct membership vote on supporting the BDS movement. And this was the first time this had happened in the United States. There had actually only been maybe 2 or 3 motions that we knew about nationally that had supported BDS. So we held this statewide membership vote. It was very contentious. We got a lot of backlash, but we were successful. The membership voted overwhelmingly to endorse the union joining the BDS movement, and a majority of members also individually committed to join the academic boycott. And it was really interesting for me. I was on the statewide executive board at that time and was the sort of like legal liaison and spokesperson for the union on this. And so was sort of handling some of the external issues that came up. And it was quite amazing to see the pushback we got at that time 10 years ago from the broader labor movement. So we actually got a letter from the Teamsters, not our union, but the sort of truck drivers and other transport and logistics workers union in the US, really taking us to task for holding this vote and saying, how could you consider doing this thing which will, in their understanding, harm our members who work in arms factories? And that was something that they felt completely comfortable sending out at that time to another union. And our union at the time, the UAW, nationally basically just took a unilateral decision to overturn our vote. So that was the status quo 10 years ago. I mean, today we have a completely different situation nationally within the UAW. So we've had a kind of union democracy caucus called United All Workers for Democracy, which came to power in the past couple of years. New national leadership under Sean Fain. And under this new leadership, strongly supported by these rank and file members from across both the auto sector and the academic sectors of the union, there has been very strong support for Palestine like we've really never seen in a mainstream U.S. union ever. So, Sean Fain has been very consistent in speaking out, and the union took a very important decision quite early on. I believe it was November, December time, calling for a ceasefire and calling for an exploration of the union's investment portfolio, and also looking into the plants that their members work in who are producing things that are being used. So it's a very different scenario. And now we have this situation where students and workers from the University of California across the state are participating in the encampments. The encampment at UCLA obviously has gotten a tremendous amount of publicity because of the horrific attack it sustained from Zionists and far-right nationalist groups that was aided and abetted by the police who stood by under the direction of the university. And that was the sort of immediate cause of the union taking this strike vote, and members, not only defending their right to protest, but calling, as Raya said, for the university to accede to many of the demands that the protesters were making. So this is totally unprecedented. The U.S., like the U.K., is a country where political strikes are generally unlawful and very, very rare, but they're doing this within the context of what's called an unfair labor practice strike, addressing their conditions of employment. And I think it really shows the role that this kind of creative engagement with the law in countries like the US and UK can play in enabling workers to take action under these situations. Certainly some of the research that Rafif and I have done in recent years and the dock worker action speaks to this as well, with community members setting up community picket lines that unionized dock workers have then refused to cross on health and safety grounds. So yeah, a couple of very inspiring examples there with a lot of learnings, I think, for all of us.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I was going to ask about some of the block the boats actions, and indeed ask about how differences in labour law between countries affects the kinds of actions that have taken place. And I was going to ask about, the relationship, I guess, between community-based organising and worker organising, and how a good sort of relationship can affect the efficacy of action. Is there any more that you'd like to say on that? Because it's clearly been such a big site of kind of action and success, over the last 10 years or so.
Yeah, I'm sure Rafif will speak on this as well. So we have this ongoing research project that we've been carrying out over a number of years, speaking with dock worker union activists and community activists in several countries, including the US and Sweden and South Africa and Tunisia, where we've seen these port-based actions. And yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the country context in terms of the legal differences is really significant. In Sweden, in 2010, the dock worker union, their leadership just simply decided we're not going to handle Israeli cargo. I mean, that would be an incredibly difficult thing to do legally in countries like the UK or the US. So in other countries like the US, again, they've had to find these sort of creative workarounds. And the US is probably the country where we've seen the most port-based actions. So there have been actions in the ports of Oakland and Seattle and Los Angeles, Long Beach, and New York, New Jersey, smaller actions in Tampa, and actions as well in Canada at the Port of Vancouver and the Port of Prince Rupert. So North America has been very strong in this area of port-based actions, particularly in 2014 and 2021. And that interplay between the community side and the union side is so critical for the success of those actions, when it's very difficult legally for workers to take action on their own, to simply go on strike. So you get these kind of intricate choreographies between community activists who have close connections to insiders in the union who serve as sort of bridge builders or go-betweens to help the community activists really understand the context for the union, the political context, the legal context, how the union makes decisions, their governance structure, and so on, as well as helping the community activists, orient to the port, the geography of the port, which are the terminals to hit, what time, how do they track the ships, how do they know how long they're going to be there, and so on. So very close collaborations and those organizing relationships, the effectiveness of those organizing relationships is really absolutely central. We have seen blockades that have been pulled off at ports with little union support, but they don't tend to be very long lasting. So they tend to be sort of one-offs that go for a few hours. And that's great that the activists have been able to pull that off. But the most effective actions we've seen have happened in places like Oakland, California, where Local 10 of the International Longshore and Warehouse Union has this long history of radical politics and has developed a very close relationship with community-based activists over a number of years and very close collaboration. And so because these actions really depend on workers refusing to cross community picket lines, refusing to go into the workplace and handle the cargo, that's why it's so important to really try to build those strong-rooted organizing relationships.
Yeah, I just want to take us back to the trade union call from Palestine, because that call very much centered the idea of halting the arms trade, of making sure that the factories that are producing the arms and where they're being shipped is stopped. And for us to do that, for us to achieve that goal, it makes a lot more sense if the workers inside are actually dropping, just stopping the production line or not doing the movement of these things. If ultimately our goal is to actually impact the arms trade, it makes sense when the workers inside the factories or on the docks are on side and actually not handling those products. Ultimately, we don't want to just block a factory for a few hours or for a day. We want that contract to be dropped completely, forever. And for that to happen, it's very important to have that relationship between inside the factory and the community activists outside. The community activists outside, as Katie was just explaining, can really bring the power to bear on shutting down the factory for a day, but also speaking with workers about the arms trade, about what is happening in Gaza today, ensuring that they become active members of their union that speak out on Palestine. So those community pickets are really educational spaces and they are really outreach spaces for the workers themselves to learn about Palestine, to learn about the arms trade, but also to become union organizers. And this takes us back to your first question, Toreya, around why should unions do this? I think this is how the trade union itself becomes reinvigorated. You get new activists that learn about the contracts they're working on, but also learn about the power of the union, that they as workers need to be involved to understand what they're producing, why they're producing it, and where it's going. So in everything we've seen, whether in arms factory or on the docks, community activists understanding the trade union, understanding the history of the trade union, the struggles of that trade union, the struggles of the workers within the factory is really important for that conversation. And I always go back to our ultimate aim. Our ultimate aim and what the call from Palestine was about is a halt to the arms trade. That's what we want to happen, not for a few hours, but an actual ending of those supplies that keep going. And for us to do that, community activists and trade unions need to be working together. And ultimately, what we've seen in the various places we've looked at, up and down the UK, but also around the world, that's when the actions are most effective. It's when that slow building takes place, it's where that communication takes place, and we keep that goal in mind of actually ending the contracts once and for all.
I guess just on that, I mean, what's your sense of the position of workers in trade unions within the factories themselves? I appreciate that's talking about a large number of people there, but have you got any sense of people feeling uncomfortable and not wanting to produce goods that are bound for Israel?
I mean, absolutely. I think that's happening. And we get questions on a daily basis of people working in factories. And once they see the picket lines outside and once people speak to them, they start questioning. But that's where it's very important how we speak to workers on these picket lines, reaching out to them, telling them why we are there, not yelling at them or screaming at them makes a huge difference because ultimately they are allies that we want to organize. Organizing within the arms industry is a very difficult thing for people who are anti-militarist in general. It's a sector that builds weapons. Like that's what it's based on. So trying to organize within that sector is extremely difficult. Trying to convince people that those factories themselves can be doing something different is a huge ask. But ultimately, we are speaking about not just Palestine, but changing those industries and changing our economies to more just economies that produce things that are actually helpful for humanity, not just destructive. And this leads us to that much bigger conversation around our economies, a just transition. What does that all mean? And this all part and parcel of the conversations trade unions need to be having today. And I'm sure Raya has a lot to add to this from the conversations we've been having around factory organizing and also how that works within the trade union movement. We've seen Unite the Union, for example, putting out statements about this kind of work from the leadership perspective, saying our job is just to protect jobs. And what we are saying is, no, actually, unions have a bigger job than just that. They have a job of also putting forward visions of the world that are more just for workers. But maybe Raya can elaborate a bit more about what's been going on in Unite in particular.
Just to follow up from what Rafif was saying in relation to kind of shifts that are also happening internally within these very hard to organize within and operate within sectors, right, such as the arms industry, that even within those we have seen movements and shifts that are very small, that are inadequate to answer to the need of the moment, but nonetheless they are very significant milestones and shifts that we have to recognize and kind of think about and build on. Very early on in October, the organizers within the aerospace industry in Unite in the UK, which is the union that unionizes most of the workers in the arms industry and one of the biggest unions in the country, that nominally had a very good policy on Palestine. It had a BDS policy passed a very long time ago, but still was kind of, its members were still very much complicit and involved. You know, it was kind of, the members were involved in arms production that were going into the F-35 and other weaponry that was used by Israel in its attack on Gaza and in other attacks on Palestinians for a long time. And very early on in October, organizing by Unite members within that sector forced the leadership to issue a position that mandated them to allowing workers to refuse to work on products destined to Israel without being disciplined in a way. So allowing workers the space to go and talk to their reps if they felt like that's something that they didn't want to work on. Later on, in April this year, a much stronger position was also put out that was much more kind of in support of against the supply of arms to Israel, but with a little caveat that it's not about parts, that they will not support the ban of export of parts that end up in military products that is then destined to Israel, which is the majority of what kind of the UK is producing, right? It's not directly end result weapons that are going to Israel, but it's much more around specific parts that are then shipped to the US or other countries that are then kind of assembled and destined to Israel. And I think it has been, for many activists on the outside, it has been surprising to hear and to learn and to kind of accept also that there are workers within that industry internally that are working to organize their colleagues and to kind of inform them about the complicity of that sector as a whole with what is going on in Palestine, and that they're internally working towards shifting their union positions and moving away from these kind of contracts like Rafif was talking about. And these some often are, steps such as passing motions to support, for example, medical aid for Palestine, forcing a conversation within a branch meeting around Palestine, having a conversation after kind of blockades happen outside of the factory with the workers inside about why that blockade was taking place, what is the impetus of that, of people coming to that factory, and so on. And so I think building on what Katie and Rafif were saying earlier about this kind of duality of having workers on the inside and supported by community activists on the outside, and the community activists on the outside recognizing that there are workers on the inside that are also trying to achieve the same goals, and kind of thinking through of how those two elements reinforce each other. Because often there is the tendency, as Rafif mentioned, of kind of looking at the arms industry and just assuming that everybody that works in the arms industry is very much invested in it. They don't care about Palestinian life, and they're not interested in kind of also moving away from war-making economies to more just-based economies, right? And I think this moment and these examples really prove differently, and I think really prove to us that we have to kind of think seriously about what does it mean to have those two elements working together. And we see these shifts kind of taking place. They're not as fast as we want them to be, but they are important building stones and building blocks that we have to think through how we work with them and how we think about them seriously, even in such a sector that is as difficult to organize in as the arms trade. It is way more difficult than, transport sectors and so on. But there is also a history in this sector of workers dropping the tools, right? Of saying, no, we will not be producing weapons that are destined. We think about it in terms of Chile and other moments in history. And I think what is happening now in terms of the organizing in relation to Palestine and in response to the call from the Palestinian trade union movement also points to the direction of the possibilities. Yeah.
I guess just picking up on some of the points that Raya raised, I think one of the reflections that I've had is many of the challenges of doing this work on Palestine with workers is really not that dissimilar from general challenges that workers face organizing in their workplaces, right? So the issue of, feeling intimidated, right? Feeling intimidated going up against your employer, feeling intimidated if you're pushing for your union to take a very different position than the leadership have taken. These are difficult things to do. And so the challenges there, I think a lot of the lessons are the broader lessons that we would try to impart in doing that kind of organizing, workplace organizing. And this goes to a point that Raya made earlier about how doing this kind of work on Palestine can empower workers to, to fight in other ways in their workplaces as well. It goes in both directions. But just along those lines, I wanted to just point out that on the Workers in Palestine website, we have created a few resources specifically on this. So there is an organizing guide for trade unionists who are interested in doing this work within their own unions. There are some general tips for community activists who are getting started working with trade unions. And then there's a more in-depth organizing guide that we put together for community activists who are specifically interested in working in the arms industry. And I'll just point to just a few of the key tips that we raised that I don't think we've discussed so far. One is the importance of doing your research as a community activist, really understanding the industry, understanding the company, understanding what the contracts are, how that's affecting what's happening on the ground in Gaza, understanding how many workers might be involved in those contracts. Being able to speak to those issues really gives outside organizers a lot more credibility. We've also emphasized the importance of being concise and specific with the messaging and demands. So I think that this is particularly a pitfall that many community activists face. When we do Palestine work in the community, the focus is on broadly educating the public about Palestine. And with workplace stuff, it's really important to drill down on what is your employer doing? How exactly is your employer complicit? And what leverage do you have as a worker? And really driving that message home that workers do have power, even if they feel disenfranchised or intimidated, workers organizing together on this do have power. We've talked already about the importance of bridge builders, but that really can't be emphasized enough. It's much better to put the time and effort into trying to build just even one or just a handful of really strong contacts on the inside before launching a broader campaign, because there's a risk of things not going so well if a group of people show up without having done that legwork ahead of time. And those insiders not only are helpful for getting the message across to their coworkers and building support, but they also often have really critical information that can be very helpful for campaigners to understand before they go in. So again, for anyone interested in doing this work, I would just point them to some of the resources on the website, not just the organizing guides, but also the research and campaigning tools that they can find there.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. We'll definitely share the links in the metadata for the episode. I've just found this really interesting. I used to do quite a lot of anti-arms activism as a university student, and then sort of as a young person living in London after I graduated. And I think the point that Raya made about the fact that a lot of the time the workers in these workplaces, they're not like just monsters who love the idea of producing weapons that are going to get bombs dropped on innocent people necessarily, but we often sort of treat them that way in our head. We have a sort of adversarial mentality within movements oftentimes because it makes it easier to go and put yourself out there and, do direct actions or whatever it is. But, it's interesting to maybe link this back to university encampments as well. One thing that I recall very, very strongly from doing sort of anti-arms trade activism at uni was just the prevalence of this industry on campus. That might be sponsoring, funding engineering departments by and large, which then kind of already is funneling prospective workers into certain sectors of the engineering industry. But also just like, the arms trade's sort of presence at, careers fairs and so on. They often kind of sneak in there, and often the work that you do as activists is trying to problematize that a bit. But yeah, I mean, maybe we could talk a bit about the university encampments that have sprung up internationally, but here in Britain and the US and elsewhere, because it is a sort of major flashpoint for the international solidarity movement at the moment. And yes, one of the kind of recurring themes, I think, of a lot of these encampments demands is institutional divestment from Israeli companies, which clearly ties in, again, with that call that was made by the Palestinian trade union movement. So yeah, could we maybe speak a little bit about student-led activism in the context of the encampments and how that's intersecting with trade union activity as well, whether that's the lecturers' unions or so on? I know that there's been activity at King's and Sheffield where Rafah and Katie are based. So yeah, I just welcome any sort of insight or thoughts on the encampments.
I was just at our university encampment yesterday. It's incredible. They are now on day 10 in King's College London, and they've put forward demands to the administration around disclosing and divesting. Of course, we've been putting these demands forward for quite some time. It's been years that this kind of work has been happening. Remarkably, the institutions across the board have been silent about it, dodging it, saying there's nothing they can do, hiding behind portfolios. But also, a lot of work is happening within our union, the UCU, around divestment of our pension fund, adopting boycotts, divestments, and sanctions. So there's multiple levels of work happening on university campuses. I think we have to tie this conversation to the marketization of education and around how universities have basically been transformed with the marketization of education to use students as ATM machines and partner with corporations. Doesn't matter what the corporations are, as long as the money is coming in. So universities, instead of being spaces for education, become slightly no different than Amazon or any other corporation printing out degrees. And to me, disclosing and divesting is really a first step in a conversation around democratizing universities, but also ensuring that education is free. That is really the heart of this question, is that universities should not be an investment ground for the arms industry or any other industry for that matter. They should be spaces of education. So the students have put forward these demands. The encampments have been inspiring to see. It's remarkable that young students are really leading the movement in so many ways, putting themselves out there day in and day out. A week ago, our students were camping under the rain, and they still sat there and they still camped under the rain. They've done the hard research. If you see some of those reports coming out of the LSE or Sheffield, this is what every educator should want. They should want their students to be able to put together reports like this, where the research is deep, the arguments are clear. Like, this is what we write student comments about, this is what we want to do. Today, we just heard that the University of Barcelona, because of the student encampment over there, has actually called for a severing of all ties with Israeli universities, Israeli institutions, and they will also be lobbying for the EU to cut those kinds of ties. We've seen some universities in the Netherlands at least say that they will set up committees to look at their connections with Israeli universities. In this country, no university has budged yet. Even worse, we see a retraction on old commitments they have made, now saying that universities need to be neutral on everything. And this should scare all of us, not just for the Palestine movement, but for the climate justice movement, for the anti-racist movement. If universities become spaces that are just sitting above society, saying they will take no stand, that's scary for any movement out there. That's scary for all of us. But the work is happening. On the academics side, there have been pledges for boycott in various universities. This is saying, okay, we've signed the petitions to management. They haven't replied to us. We're going to take personal pledges right now. And there's hundreds of signatures already on these pledges. I think this is just the beginning of the movement on universities, and we'll have to build it. The work of building is always slow, meticulous work. We are always the ones that have to do the research and be clear about it. But ultimately, we are on the right side of history. But I think we should be seeing this not just as divest and disclose for Palestine, but divest and disclose to save the education system altogether and demarketize it.
Yeah, made me think of the Howard Zinn autobiography title, You Can't Be Neutral in a Moving Train, right? I mean, yeah, it touches on everything. I mean, we've been talking for quite a while. There's more things that I guess I could have brought in. Obviously, it was Eurovision recently. I know that the Flemish language Belgian TV broadcast interrupted the semi-final broadcast with a statement saying it was an industrial action, that it was interrupting it in protest. So, I mean, it might have been nice to talk about cultural workers, but I'm not sure that we necessarily have the time. So maybe it would be good to just conclude with anything that any of you wants to raise that hasn't been touched on yet that you feel is important to share in this conversation. Rafif?
I think this is a very important conversation. It would be great to speak about cultural workers, and all this means is that we need another episode.
Yes.
But I also wanted to do a plug for some of the Pluto books on trade union organizing. Particularly, there's Workers Can Win, a guide to organizing at work, which I have learned a lot from. So I think for anyone thinking through organizing, whether on campus, but also within your trade union, that's a very, very useful book. And generally, most of the Pluto books on organizing within your workplace are really worth a read.
Yeah, thanks, Rafif. Worth pointing out, there's always a standing discount for books related to these episodes. So that book we will make 40% off. Podcast is the coupon code on plutobooks.com. Well, thanks to you all once again. It's been a really, really great conversation. It's been wonderful to hear you all talk, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the show. That was Rafif Ziada, Raya Al-Sana and Katie Fox-Hodas on Radicals in Conversation. If you want to find out more about the work being done by workers in Palestine, go to workersinpalestine.org, where you'll find an array of resources relating to the call to stop arming Israel. A number of our books, including Workers Can Win, a guide to organising at work, are 40% off using our usual podcast discount code. Head over to plutobooks.com/podcast reading for more information. We'll be back soon with another episode of Radicals in Conversation. So until then, thanks for listening and goodbye.